Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Strange Humanoids Around the World, 10 Eyewitness Accounts. I love talking about those humanoids. There's so many different kinds, so many interesting interactions that people have. It's been taking place for so long, so yeah, that's the theme of today's show. I've chosen 10 cases, of course, all over the world. Mostly the United States, but one from Canada, one from England, France, Denmark, Sweden, Spain. So a pretty wide geographical area. And of course, stretching over a long period of time. In fact, 5 decades, cases from the 50s all the way up through the 1990s. So some older accounts and some modern ones, but all involving humanoids of different kinds. Many involving, well, most involving multiple eyewitnesses and, of course, a wide variety of evidence. These humanoid cases, I think, have so much to teach us. Pretty sure you haven't heard about most of these cases, but we will see. And let's start with our first case, which I call brown-skinned midget ETs. I've had a number of people ask me, why aren't there any ETs with darker skin? Well, of course there are, and there's quite a few of them. So I wanted to feature a case just to reinforce that. This case took place in the fall of 1957 in a little town called Ejstrupholm, Denmark. And it's quite an interesting case that remained hidden for many years until being brought forth by researchers. This case was investigated by researcher X.P. Madsen and was published in the November-December 1975 issue of the Danish magazine UFO Nyt, or UFO News. It was a case that actually remained hidden for many years until researchers tracked down the witness, who at the time of his encounter was a 15-year-old boy. The incident occurred one day around 2 to 3 p.m., again in the fall of 1957, as the witness was collecting grain in a field just a mile or so south of the small village of Ejstrupholm. Now you can see the field here. It was a cloudy day, and as he worked, he had the sudden and strange sensation that he was being watched. Turning around, he was amazed to see a saucer-shaped craft parked in a field about 100 feet away. Pretty close. He says there were two very short people standing next to it looking right at him. Now he describes this craft as metallic gray, oval, with a cupola on top, and it wasn't huge, about 6 feet tall, 8 feet wide, and it was resting on 3 landing legs, each about 3 feet long and a half-foot thick. But even more amazing, of course, were the two strange humanoids, who the witness said did look pretty much like us, humans, except that they were only about 3 feet tall. He said they had brown skin, and they were wearing skin-tight, shiny, dark green jumpsuits, which covered them from the neck down, including their hands. He says it was weird because there were no buttons, zippers, or any features of any kind on the suits. But on their heads they wore large, transparent, fishbowl-type helmets, with what looked to him like antennae attached to them, sweeping down towards the rear of their head. Now the witness was absolutely shocked, and after watching it for a few minutes, he started to become a little nervous, so nervous that he began to look around for rocks to throw at these little figures and defend himself should they approach. The next thing he knew, these two little ETs turned towards each other. Then there was a brilliant flash of light, and they were gone. And almost instantly the craft in the field took off obliquely, going upwards and in perfect silence, and was gone in seconds. Now, looking where the landing legs of the craft had rested on the ground, the witness did see that the vegetation there had been flattened. But he was so shocked and in complete disbelief about what he had seen. He almost didn't believe his own eyes, he said. And he was afraid of being ridiculed if he should talk about it, so he told nobody but his closest family. A few years after this occurred, a researcher from the Scandinavian UFO Information Organization did hear rumors about the sighting, but wasn't able to track down the witness. However, 15 years later, in 1972, an audience member of a UFO lecture in the town of Virum actually knew about the case and connected the witness to researchers, and that's how we finally learned about it. Now that is a single witness case, but it's super interesting. The witness did get a very close-up look at the ETs. There was also apparent landing traces. It's a shame that it wasn't investigated more thoroughly, but it's a very interesting close-up encounter, which again shows that ETs come in all different shapes, sizes, and of course, skin colors. It should be no surprise just looking at all the different variations we have here on Earth. Same is true for the ETs. And here's another case which shows that. I call this one Lover's Lane Aliens. It's interesting because there's quite a few cases of people who are out, having a little bit of a good time out there on a private little road somewhere in a rural area usually. But yeah, a number of cases of people who see ETs while out there on the road with their boyfriend or girlfriend or what have you. So, this case took place in the fall of 1966 in a little rural area outside of Rockford, Illinois, and it's quite a fascinating case. This case comes from an anonymous woman whose initials are LK, and she reported her encounter in a written letter almost 2 decades after it happened, and she did speak with researchers as well. But it took her a long time to report it because, as she says, I have tried to block this out in order to live as sane and normal a life as I can. I'm married to a respectable attorney. Now, the incident in question occurred late one fall evening in 1966, again in Rockford, Illinois. LK and her boyfriend wanted to make out, and they decided to drive to a private rural location, kind of a lover's lane type situation, where they hoped nobody would see them, which is often what they did when they wanted to be alone and intimate. As LK writes, when we parked, we always made sure that there would be complete privacy, so we wouldn't be interrupted or a policeman wouldn't be coming along. So they found a gravel road about a mile off of a paved road, and they were enjoying each other's company when a brilliant light distracted them. And as LK says, the only reason we looked up was because of the sudden bright light. The light was very bright, like when someone is welding. It hurt my eyes. All we wanted to do was get out of there. I started the car, and we drove across an old metal bridge, only to discover that it was a dead end. The road went into farm fields, so I turned the car around and stepped on the gas. We had to go right past where we had been parked. Now, when they saw this light, they said it appeared to be coming down towards treetop level. And now, passing this exact location where they had seen this painfully bright white light, they saw something else. 2 apparent aliens standing side by side, looking right back at them. As LK says, I saw 2 gray figures with large slanted eyes and with square insignia near the heart area. I didn't feel threatened at the time of the sighting. As much as I wanted to flee the area, I felt safe near it. So she felt that was kind of an odd reaction. But despite this, of course, they did drive off. They did notice a couple of other things. As LK says, the hair on my arms and head felt like it was standing on end. Now, they also both noticed a very strong pungent odor, which they said was, quote, super metallic, like sulfur or iron. When speaking with a researcher years later, the witness, according to the researcher, showed, quote, obvious relief. She did break up with her boyfriend 2 years later, but kept in touch. And as LK says, we will never forget what happened, and I've never had any other experiences. Here we have another example of a witness keeping their experience secret for a very long time, simply out of fear of ridicule. Such a shame. Most people are not reporting their encounters, which again means any estimate of how many cases there are like these, it's far more than we think. That is clear. Because here's another case. There are so many cases like this, you guys. It's unbelievable. So many that I think it's absolutely undeniable that these things are taking place. Because a lot of these cases show remarkable commonalities and similarities, little details that you couldn't make up. And here's a really wonderful case, probably my favorite in this bunch. I call this one the ETs in a melon field. And this is a very unusual case which took place on September 12, 1971 in the little town of Aznalcóllar, Spain. This is not a huge area, 8,000 people or so, certainly less back then. A lot of melons are grown in southern Spain, and this one involves a case in which a UFO landed, right in the middle of a field of melons, a huge melon farm. And some very interesting things happened in this particular case. The main witness in this case is Juan Rodriguez Dominguez, an older gentleman who was employed as the guard of a vast melon patch known locally as El Lunarejo. This is located not far from the town of Aznalcóllar in Seville, Spain. He was there like any other day, staying near his hut in the center of this farm, and it was just getting dark around dusk when he saw a humongous, oval-shaped silver object drop down from the sky and settle in for a landing on one of the hills of the melon farm not far away from him. It reminded him somewhat of a bus locally known as the Traveler. This bus ran a regular route between the towns of Aljarafe to Seville. Now, Juan had really given no thought to UFOs or visitors from space throughout his life, but it was clear to him at this point that this was a spaceship of some kind. He said it was shaped like a missile, and its shiny metallic surface was actually glinting in the rays of the setting sun. Now, feeling a strong wave of fear at the high strangeness of this object, he quickly made sure he had his gun and held tightly on to his double-barreled shotgun. He carried this with him during his job, and he got it ready, quote, just in case it was necessary. Now, seconds after this very large object landed, two small doors located at either end of this massive craft opened up. Two little ramps extended to the ground, and a crowd of little, quote, dwarves came out, and each of them was dressed in this strange one-piece blue uniform. And they were tiny little things, only about 3 feet tall. Juan did notice that something covered their faces which prevented him from seeing what they looked like. Now, he's not really thinking ETs. That wasn't part of his paradigm. He was wondering, could they be military? Was this some kind of attack? But why had they landed in this remote melon patch? And there were about 20 of these little guys outside the ship, wandering around. And then, at this point, he noticed that a, quote, regiment of the little beings, moving in 2 rows, were approaching an artesian well. This well supplied water to irrigate the farm. Now, he was now dismayed, and knowing that he was the only witness, he really just felt like he had no choice. And he decided to stand up and reveal himself. Instantly, at this point, one of the little men pointed something like a powerful flashlight at Juan, which he said blinded and dazzled him, almost making him fall to the ground. And immediately, and to his shock, 6 of the beings started to walk very quickly towards his hut, firing periodic bursts of light from their flashlights, or whatever these things were, which he said produced eye irritation and an unbearable pain in his head. So now he was terrified. He immediately started to run away towards the town, and he said he had gone about 600 feet when he turned around to check and see what was happening, and he was not happy to see that 2 of these little dwarves were following right behind him, still aiming their flashlights on him. So he quickly turned back around and kept running away, not daring to look back. In fact, he ran the entire way back to town, which was almost 2 miles. He ran up to a group of about a dozen people. Now again, he was kind of an older man, but very well known, very respected by the people of the town, and they were shocked to see him stumbling and falling, getting up and running in absolute terror, and screaming out, "The traveler! The traveler!" So a crowd of people quickly formed around him. They helped him stand up. They tried to get him to calm down. It took some effort to pry his hands loose from his shotgun and get him to explain what had happened. So Juan fearfully then spilled out his story, and seeing Juan's panicked state and knowing him to be an honest man, nobody doubted his story. By then, the Chicaros family, they were the co-owners of the melon farm, they immediately ran towards the location with a number of other people. And when they reached the spot that Juan had described, the craft and the humanoids, of course, were gone. But as they examined the area, they found dozens of sets of tiny footprints, which they said looked like they were made by small booties. They were particularly numerous around the little well there. So everyone there was very much impressed that the events had occurred exactly as Juan had described, and together they made a pact to keep quiet about it, knowing how incredible it would sound to outsiders. However, the next day, Juan, apparently unable to get this incident out of his mind, reported it to the civil guard. They asked him why he had not used his gun, and he replied simply, "If I had shot, they would have surrounded me, and at this hour I wouldn't be able to tell you anything." Now this case was published in Iker Jimenez's Spanish language book, Encuentros OVNI, which means UFO encounters. Just for your information, Spain is the world's second biggest melon exporter, and many of these melons are grown in this area. And the city of Asno Kolar, where this occurred, would later become infamous when a nearby dam burst, releasing about 5 million cubic meters of acidic mine tailings into the nearby river Agrio and other rivers, polluting a pretty wide area. What a case that was. I mean, I can only imagine seeing that many ETs, being chased by them, them having them shoot their little ray guns, pew, 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 at you. I mean, I don't mean to make light of it. That was clearly a very scary experience for the witness. And I'm glad that he had the support of the people who loved and trusted him. And of course there were landing traces, footsteps, and so forth. Footprints, I should say. What a wild case. And here's another one. I mean, just case after case. I call this next one Nuclear Researcher Humanoid Encounter. This is a multiple witness case which took place on June 29, 1973, not far from Chalk River. This is in Ontario, Canada. And what's interesting to me about this case is that these witnesses did see this UFO and humanoids very close up. It was unmistakable. But to me, the most interesting thing is who the witness is. This case comes from Canadian researchers Guido Hovell and Don Donderi. The witnesses have requested anonymity, but I'll call them for here Chuck and his wife Hallie. Now, at the time of his encounter, Chuck was an engineering professor and a former assistant dean at McGill University in Montreal, a former RAF pilot, and when it came to UFOs, he described himself as, quote, an open-minded skeptic. So a good witness, a smart guy. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because over the summer he had been doing nuclear research at the Laboratory of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. Now, on the night of July 29, 1973, he was returning from the nuclear company where he had done this research to continue his professorship at the university. He was driving with his wife Hallie, and they had just left the city of Chalk River and were approaching Ottawa when Hallie noticed an unusually bright, star-like object kind of close to the horizon. And as she watched, this star-like object seemed to cross over to the left It became brighter and larger than the other stars in the sky. Now she watched this for quite some time, almost an hour, when it suddenly seemed to move towards them and became increasingly brilliant. And this was when she pointed it out to her husband Chuck. They were now on Route 17 between Ottawa and Montreal, and the sphere was now taking on an appearance that made it look very close to the ground, round, reflective, like a solid object. Hallie had the impression that this object, whatever it was interested in a nearby reservoir that was illuminated by large floodlights. So they're driving along and suddenly become parallel to this object, and it was quite close, about 100 feet away. They could now clearly see that it was a solid globe, and there was nothing underneath it. Hallie was staring at it when it suddenly shot a horizontal beam of light, and at the same time she saw the central section appear to slide back, revealing 3 large portholes. And this is when she realized that the light coming from this object was coming from these portholes. Now the object itself was blue-white, and the light coming from the portholes was yellow. And she turned to Chuck and said, "It looks like a flying house." Now, to the amazement of them both, the object started to move directly towards them. And they were even more amazed to look through these portholes and see 3 humanoid silhouettes looking down right at them. The object moved right in front of their car, moving from left to right, and then quickly disappeared in about 10 seconds. There was light traffic on the road, but weirdly, none of the other cars seemed to pay any attention to this object. Later, they did try reporting this sighting to officials, even submitting their drawing of the object with these little humanoids, and they were told that they had seen a, quote, DC-9 aircraft approaching Upland Airport. Now, researcher Guido Hovell says, and I quote, "The NRC explanation was utterly absurd and naive, and the witnesses were very dissatisfied with it." I bet. I am too. Now, researcher Guido Hovell was intrigued very much that this object came so close to the witnesses. And as he says, "So here is a mystery within a mystery. Why did the object disappear after its obvious show of interest?" I mean, this object was close enough that the occupants had to know they were being observed. Once again, we see authorities absolutely paying no attention, no serious attention to a person's sighting, issuing debunking explanations without even researching it. It's such a shame. But yeah, to me, the most interesting aspect of that particular encounter is the fact that the witness is a professor, a scientist, a nuclear researcher. We know from first-hand contactee accounts that ETs are very concerned about our use of nuclear material in any capacity, and I wonder if this was an intentional display showing themselves off to someone who perhaps they knew was very knowledgeable about nuclear materials. Of course, that is pure speculation, but I have to wonder, given that this is a very common message given to contactees by the ETs. And now we move to another really unusual case. This one has got quite a few witnesses, animal reactions, physiological effects, landing traces, and it took place over a period of days, and some really other unusual effects as well. It's a really remarkable case, which I call Humanoids Investigate a Gravesite. This took place again over a period of days, weeks really, from about July 23rd to the beginning of August. This was in 1977 in the very, very small town of Lindley, New York. And I think you'll agree this is a case worthy of more attention. This case came to the attention of UFO researcher Alan Hendry when he was monitoring the Center for UFO Studies police hotline, and he actually flew to the location and interviewed the witnesses personally. It was around 1 a.m. on July 23, 1977, when Monica, age 26, and her niece Janine, age 13, had arrived home in the small town of Lindley, a very small town, after attending a stock car race event. They noticed that their little pet Dachshund, Cubby, started barking, and they thought that there might be kids in the area who had recently been suspected of thievery. So she let out her other larger dog, a German Shepherd, who didn't seem to react in any way. However, going back inside, both Monica and Janine looked out the window and noticed about 11 or 12 star-like objects moving around in all directions. All seemed quite low and had a weird halo surrounding them. Then they saw one bright light suddenly appear right over a small hill about 900 feet away. At the same time, they heard a quote, whooshing noise, and this was followed by sounds like stones falling in the nearby creek bed. And looking in that area, they saw 2 4-foot-tall figures in front of a tree. And it was weird because these figures seemed to be floating up and down. They were watching these 2 figures when suddenly more appeared, several of them, carrying what looked like flashlights. And these figures started wandering all over the creek bed area, also onto the neighbor's property. Now these figures appeared to be wearing dark divers' suits with a sort of greenish tint, and they had glowing green belts. And all of them were moving in this weird floating, hopping motion. Monica was about to call her sister, Janine's mother, but Janine said, no, let's not do that. These figures will probably leave. But they didn't. And in fact, events escalated when suddenly a red light, which they described as being rectangular, suddenly approached the creek and then receded back. Something very weird happened. At this point, both Janine and Monica reported a sudden headache. And both witnesses then saw something they could hardly believe. One of these figures appeared on a small hill a short distance away and began to illuminate a large lone tombstone, a gravestone that was sitting on a hill just beyond the creek on the neighbor's property. The figure walked, or rather floated, away from it, then returned and lit up the tombstone again, at which point this tombstone, which you can see here, it's quite heavy and large, it began to rise up into the air and sway back and forth. So both Monica and Janine now saw a taller figure standing on the hill. And this is weird. This taller figure started calling out with an ooh, ooh sound, at which point all the figures approached the tall one for just a few moments and then scattered back out into the field. Without warning, one of the figures appeared right beneath the second-story bedroom window. And as soon as Monica and Janine saw him, this figure quickly crouched down, apparently to hide from view. Ironically, this posture brought his face closer to his glowing belt, which allowed Janine to see that he had sort of a normal human-looking face. She couldn't be sure, but that's what she thought she saw. Now, to their shock, this figure walked right up to the back door and began to jiggle the door handle, and they also heard several more of these figures walking around behind the house. Now this was enough to get Monica to call her sister and then the police. It was now 3:45 a.m. So this had been going on for well over 2 hours. The witnesses did notice another thing. Whenever a car would drive by, they would duck down. Their house was right along the highway there. The police arrived shortly later, but just before they arrived, the figures fled the area. The glowing objects rose back up into the sky and took on a star-like appearance. More family members arrived. Everyone quickly searched the area, and they did find something interesting. There were some crushed cucumber plants, some oddly split rocks, little holes in the ground. They looked at the tombstone, and it showed no evidence of having been moved. They did, however, find what looked like 3 odd footprints in a straight line right along the driveway. Each was about 8 inches long and had no treads or heel marks, so certainly not a normal footprint. Now, as I said, both Monica and Janine did get a headache when this red light appeared, and it persisted for about 2 days. And not only that, they experienced dry throats, ringing of the ears, and sluggishness. And both were really shocked to learn that this encounter had endured for about 3 hours, because they both felt it was closer to 1 hour. Now, investigators did contact the local FAA near Elmira, who had no information to offer. Also, the next door neighbors didn't see anything, although they were up late. Later, Janine did agree to undergo hypnosis, but no new details emerged. However, events were still in progress, because it was just a few days later, on the evening of July 25 and 26, about 6 miles from where Monica and Janine lived, a man by the name of Donald heard a noise at his door, and looking outside, he saw a 4-foot-tall humanoid wearing a jumpsuit standing near his porch. Presumably, these are the same guys Monica and Janine saw. So, Donald grabbed a flashlight and a gun and stepped out on the porch. He aimed his flashlight at the humanoid, which illuminated the humanoid, but it also illuminated a craft hovering over a nearby tree. And instantly, a beam of light came from the craft and struck Donald, knocking him back, he said. So he ran into the house, dazed. He said he felt like his head was going to explode, his whole body felt numb, his ears were ringing, and he was experiencing strange cramps in his body. And so was his wife, who had remained inside. But they looked outside, and they saw about 6 or 7 UFOs, and several humanoids now moving all over their property. And at one point, apparently on the roof, they heard something. They could also hear these figures making a strange chattering noise, and it went on all night, until about 5 a.m., at which point, suddenly, the humanoids and UFOs left. The next morning they did find footprints and a displaced metal louvre on the roof. Things were still going on because it was a couple of days later, July 28, Janine's father was in the area and said he saw a bright orange domed disc move right over the property at about 1 a.m. It hovered briefly and then disappeared. And a few days later, on August 1st, the UFOs and humanoids returned to Monica's property. And both Monica and Janine saw about 6 or 7 of these same short humanoids with these weird glowing green belts. They took a flashlight and shone it at one of these humanoids, who promptly disappeared, but he immediately reappeared when they stopped shining the flashlight on him. So seeing these humanoids, they quickly woke up Monica's father, Clifford, who said he was admittedly frightened by what he saw, didn't want to take a closer look. He wouldn't tell investigators that he saw any humanoids, but he did admit to seeing weird lights, which he said were, quote, different from anything that he had seen before. Now, both Monica and Janine reported that this weird headache came back again. Now, 2 weeks later, on August 14, 1977, their neighbor, Barbara, said she was actually followed for 1 mile back to her home, watched this light for like 3 hours, and afterwards suffered burning, watering eyes, a sore throat, and a headache, just like the other witnesses. And finally, events apparently ended on August 17. Janine stepped outside their home, it was around 10:30 p.m., and saw a glowing object emit 2 tiny green orbs, which Janine says raced right up to her, stopped about 2 to 3 feet away. She actually swung her arms at them in defense, trying to swat them away, ran back inside, then sat down, and promptly, but thankfully temporarily, forgot about them, just acted as if nothing had happened. And it was at this time that the activities seemed to stop. Now, researcher Alan Hendry, after looking into all of these events, says, needless to say, these cases still require a lot more investigation. Now, when you have that many witnesses seeing humanoids, seeing UFOs, reporting strange physiological effects, watering eyes, headaches, all these footprints and holes in the ground, a guy being knocked over by a beam of light, I mean, how much evidence do you need to say that there's something to these cases? It always kind of confuses me and puzzles me when people say, well, there's no evidence for this, no hard evidence. There is, and certainly all these witnesses who have these experiences will tell you so. But we are all victims of this brutal, ruthless, well-funded, well-orchestrated UFO cover-up that has been specifically designed to make UFO witnesses look like fools, idiots. The explanation for all these accounts has always been they're explainable by hoaxes, hallucinations, or misperceptions. But we can see clearly that that is simply not true. It's time to move past skepticism. There's far, far, far too many cases to ignore. And here is another case. This one took place in Preston. This is in Leeds, England. I call this one the ETs in the Flying Box. I wanted to feature this case because it's a very unusual UFO, some very unusual humanoids. It is mostly a single witness case, though apparently there was another witness. Unfortunately, this other witness was not interviewed, so I think we have to consider this a single witness case. But the witness did see this object very close up, and he's absolutely convinced it's unusual. He was interviewed by professional researchers, so I think it's a genuine case. It took place in the summer of 1978, again in Preston. This is in Leeds, England. This case, from British researcher Mark Birdsall, was published in the Yorkshire UFO Society's UFOS Journal. And as Mark Birdsall writes, reports of actual figures on board should interest all investigators. One such case, which has attracted a fair amount of interest, is the sighting of a UFO which was seen in the Preston area of Leeds. The witness, who requires anonymity, requires total confidentiality, reported the case to us a few weeks ago. Mr. S. has not spoken to his wife about the incident because she would think that he is unstable. She's also quite ill, by the way. But it was around 9 p.m., again in the summer of 1978, that Mr. S. was walking his dog in the Preston area and looking up was greeted with an incredible sight. As he says, I couldn't believe my eyes. Floating at very low level was a huge, kind of rectangular shaped object, black in color, except for a long, clear section of what appeared to be 7 paneled windows along one side of the object. The witness heard no noise whatsoever. There were no lights on this object itself, but the glass-looking windows did show the interior of the craft was illuminated with a sort of soft, muted light. As Mr. S. says, I couldn't understand how such a massive object stayed in the air. But even more amazing than the object itself was that the witness could see several figures in the window. Now, he said he had to really meditate to recall exactly how many and what they looked like, but he said that there were at least 9 of them. 7 of the figures could be seen in the first window at the front section of the object, another could be seen in the 3rd window, and another in the 6th window towards the rear. And after carefully thinking about it, the witness estimates that these figures were extremely tall. I mean, he's estimating about 10 feet. He says the figures in the first window were actually waving at him. Now, just so you know, he was pretty close to this object, close enough to get a good look at him. He said that they were all wearing one-piece white uniforms with a straight collar that went right up to the chin. They seemed to have faces that he described as, quote, hard, but he said that they looked like normal humans. They all had short hair that was brushed back. Now, it did take investigators a few interviews to obtain all these details. But Mr. S. said that he watched this object in absolute amazement, and realizing how unusual it was, he looked around to see if anyone else was on the street to verify what he saw. And as he says, I ran to the end of the street to gain the attention of the other man. But yeah, this was so close it was actually right in front of a church steeple. The man, as this witness says, actually looked up and could see this object, but strangely did not seem to pay it much notice. Some of the folks at the UFOS organization were a little bit unsure about the veracity of the case, but as Mark Birdsall says, the witness did talk to them several times, providing all these details, which remained consistent. So yeah, those sound like some unusually tall ETs, to say the least. Of course, it's clear that the witness is estimating their height, but he was the one who was there. And if he saw this low enough, I mean, in front of a church steeple, this is a pretty good view. So it's clear that he is absolutely convinced he saw this close enough to determine that these ETs were extremely tall. An amazing case, I think. And here is another one. Now this one is off the charts strange. And also a very close-up encounter. I mean, the ETs walked right up to the witness in this case. And I call this one ETs Offer Cake. Yes, you heard me. There are a number of cases where ETs will offer people food of various kinds. And this is a case like that I haven't heard before. And it's a really remarkable and again, professionally researched case. Occurred on December 3rd, 1979 in Västervik, Sweden. And this is a single witness case, but certainly it's a compelling testimony. And there's details to it, I think, that match so many other accounts. And the emotional reaction from the witness is clearly sincere. Her family absolutely endorsed her testimony. And as you'll see, I think it's an amazing case. This very interesting case has a single witness by the name of Lillian Carlson, who you can see here. And it was around 1 a.m. on, again, December 3rd, 1979. And Lillian was walking near her home. She lives at, let's see if I can get this right, Landgrevsgatan 43 in Västervik, Sweden. And she was just planning to walk around this large natural park area where an artificial hill had been built for skiing. You can see it here. It's a green grassy area with no trees or bushes. She was just walking along with her hands in her pocket, kind of staring at the ground in front of her. She had really just started her walk when she suddenly stopped and became frozen in her tracks because right in front of her she saw a craft. Now it wasn't touching the ground, but almost, floating about 3 feet above it. She had a very strong feeling that she was being watched, although she couldn't see any humanoids at this point. But moments later, 2 humanoids came around from behind the craft. And they were about 5 feet tall or so, 5'9", very thin. She says they were totally white and seemed to glow with light. And she could kind of hear them talking. She didn't understand, but she had the feeling that they were talking about her and discussing her, which made her feel kind of funny. She says it all seemed crazy to her. Now they were probably talking telepathically, she's not entirely sure, but she thought she heard them say that she was not ready. Ready for perhaps breeding? Anyway, as Lillian says, I couldn't hear it, but in a strange way I sensed that they were discussing my person. I felt ridiculous in their presence, but suddenly heard a voice beside me saying I shouldn't be afraid. Now, these 2 beings approached right up to her. She realized they didn't walk, they were floating a few feet above the ground. One of them held out its hand, and there was something in its hand that looked to Lillian kind of like a piece of chocolate cake. She felt like it was offering her this cake, or whatever it was. She didn't take it. They held a device or something, seemed to run it around her body. She was unable to move her hands or arms. She was totally paralyzed. She heard these 2 beings talking to each other for a few more moments, but then they turned around, headed back towards the craft. They disappeared around behind it in the same manner they had come out. Lillian then noticed that this craft was emitting a faint trail of smoke from underneath it. And without warning, the craft disappeared. She has no idea how. She did not see it move away in terms of, it flying upwards. But the moment it was gone, her paralysis disappeared. The encounter lasted, she estimates, about 5 minutes. And she was beside herself. She ran home as fast as she could. She admits that she was completely hysterical, crying. She was so upset that she even considered committing herself to the local hospital for psychiatric treatment. However, turns out her brother knew a UFO researcher by the name of Tor Wickland. So he knew about UFOs and encouraged his sister Lillian to contact Tor Wickland, which she did. And this investigator went with her back to the site the next day. They didn't find any real evidence of this craft, but to this day, Lillian is convinced that she saw a landed UFO and its crew. Yes, the witnesses in this case, quite young. ETs do seem to show a lot of interest in young people. But yeah, a very close-up encounter. Can only imagine what it must have been like to see this landed craft and have these ETs float right up to you. Man, oh man, that would be an experience for sure. Now, moving on to the next case. This one is a fascinating and really little known case. This one I call 3 Little Floating Aliens. There's multiple witnesses in this case. It's quite a remarkable series of events. It occurred on January 12, 1983 in Pine Township, Indiana. The witnesses insisted upon anonymity. They didn't even want their exact location to be known. The primary witness is a quite respected professional. So that, I think, was one of the reasons he insisted upon anonymity. But as you will see, this is an amazing and complicated encounter with what appear to be extraterrestrial humanoids. This very interesting case was investigated by the Center for UFO Studies researcher Richard A. Buse, and was actually published in their journal, the International UFO Reporter. It's an amazing multiple witness case involving a 45-year-old man by the name of Ed Egan and his 2 sons, John, age 15, and Donald, 10. Though this is apparently pseudonyms, because the witnesses do not want to be identified. And it was around dusk on January 12, 1983. Ed had just returned home from work. John and David had come home from school, and looking outside, Ed was puzzled by the sight of an L or kind of T-shaped object lit up like a neon sign about 300 feet away from his house. And he's looking at this, and seconds later, his 10-year-old son Donald shouts out, "Something is moving out there." At the same moment, their 3 dogs started barking excitedly. So, they were all looking outside at this strange glowing object, and Donald said, "Look, there's a little person holding it." So Ed and John ran outside. Don didn't have his shoes on, so he quickly got his shoes on and followed both his father and older brother. Now, Ed and John approached this glowing object and this little man, walking right up to this fence where the being stood. And once Ed got within about 50 feet of this little being, he was shocked to see that this being was actually floating about 2 or 3 feet off the ground. And it was tiny. He estimates it was about 3 feet tall, with a large, round, bald head, large eyes, very small facial features. Now at this time, it did have its back turned to him. Ed did have the feeling it was looking for something. He saw that it was wearing a light gray outfit that looked like a wetsuit with a dark gray belt that had circles or circular objects on it. The glowing L-shaped object it was holding was pretty big, about 6 feet high, 5 inches in diameter, and had fuzzy glowing edges. So Ed says, "Funny thing, I wasn't afraid." Now at this point, the younger 10-year-old Don ran outside. He was about 20 feet from the house when he saw, get this, a second identical being peering over the fence. He called out to his father, pointed out this second being, which his father also saw. So Don walked right up to the second being and said that its eyes were, quote, bigger than a person's eyes, like a frog has. Big, old eyes. He said its nose was, quote, little but caved in and flat. So Donald says as he walked up to it, quote, the thing gave me a real weird stare. Usually when you see something like that, you want to turn and go the other way, but my feet just kept going that way. Now this second being was also hovering about 2 to 3 feet above the ground. Now Ed began to approach this second being, so both he and his son Donald were approaching it from opposite sides. And as Ed approached, it turned and faced him. And this is when he got a really good look at what these beings looked like. And not only that, what they were wearing. He noticed this jumpsuit had no zippers, no buttons, seams, snaps of any kind, and he walked right up to this little thing, about 12 feet away. He was also impressed by the being's large head and huge, fish-like eyes, which he said were, quote, twice the size of human eyes and resembling a carp's. He saw eyelashes, actually, and said that occasionally the eyes would blink. He did not see any ears, and he said the nose was just, quote, 2 slits or indentations. So he calmed down his 2 sons, saying, they won't hurt us, boys. Don't be scared. But then he turned to the second being, who was now looking straight at him, and said, we won't hurt you. We won't hurt you. This being did not communicate in any way. However, at this point, the older brother, John, did become frightened and ran back into the house. At that same moment, the first being that was holding this L or T-shaped object began to float fairly quickly in a straight line towards the west. Ed, seeing this, ran after it, maintaining a steady distance of about 50 or 60 feet between him and this being. And as this first being started floating away, the second being also started floating in a straight line that appeared to intercept the destination of the first being. And it was at this moment a third being appeared, right near the small junk pile in their front yard. And it was also floating, and according to Ed, began to move, quote, very fast, and much faster than the other 2. It was again heading towards the other beings. All 3 beings quickly converged with each other at the same time. In fact, the third had moved so fast that they only saw it as sort of a blurry streak as it joined its companions. Now, to the amazement of Donald and Ed, all 3 beings began to glow brightly and shoot upwards at a 45-degree angle, actually clearing the highest trees at the far edge of their property where the forest began. This L-shaped object seemed to straighten out into a long cylinder, and in a matter of seconds, all 3 beings were gone. Now, they did decide to report this only on the condition of absolute anonymity, but they felt it was important to report it, and also they really wanted to know if anyone else had reported any kinds of experiences like theirs. This was all new to them. Now, here's another really interesting thing. Ed noticed a peculiar after effect. After this encounter, he didn't sleep that well, but he says he felt like he needed much less sleep than before, and also said that his job performance improved and everything became, quote, much better, and things come easier. I feel more authoritative and sure of myself about life. I'm not in a hurry anymore. Less stress about everything. So this really changed his whole outlook on life. I found that case so interesting and poignant. I mean, one of the kids running away in fear, the father and the son coming at either side towards the ET, who's looking back and forth at them, and the fact that they approached within feet of this little floating ET. And not your average gray, a little more human looking. Again, it shows how much variation there is in these humanoid accounts. It's interesting the way they took off, just flying up into the air. There's a lot to learn from this case. The weird alien instrument that they were holding on to. To me, the most fascinating takeaway was the fact that the primary witness experienced a really interesting reaction where he says he felt more confident and it made his whole outlook on life improve. So that is super interesting to me. All right, now we move to another case. This is a really interesting case, again involving multiple witnesses. I call this one the glowing giant. This occurred on March 6, 1983. This is in France, in a very small town called Pas-de-Calais. And there is mostly one primary witness, though as we'll see, there was actually quite a few witnesses to at least parts of this encounter. And what she saw is really strange. This next case is quite brief, but certainly interesting. The main witness is a 26-year-old woman married with 2 kids by the name of Madame Fauquemberg and her mother, Madame Boulanger. They lived together in a small subdivision of homes on the outskirts of the small town of Pas-de-Calais. And it was around 11 p.m. on March 6, 1983. Everyone in the house was shocked when the entire interior of the house became suddenly illuminated by a strange bright light. And at the same time there was a sharp noise coming from outside. And looking outside, they saw a craft of some kind that they initially thought might be a helicopter, but the noise was, quote, different. And it quickly moved away, so they didn't think too much of it and went to bed. Now the witness had gotten into the habit of leaving the light on in her children's bedroom because they slept up in the upstairs attic. And it was around 2 or 3 a.m. that she woke up to turn off this light. Now this room does have a sort of sideways facing skylight which looks down on the yard, and looking through this skylight, you can see here, she noticed a growing illumination coming from outside. The witness first thought that someone was out there using a flashlight and looking for something. It was a very dark night. All the street lights were off, so were all the lights on all the other houses. But as the witness watched, this strange glow became brighter. She could now see it was a round light, and she wondered if perhaps maybe one of the street lights had been turned on. But this light started moving, and in fact, she watched it move around a group of shrubs, stop next to a tall bush, and she was so shocked at what she saw at this point that she actually physically rubbed her eyes to see if she was dreaming. But of course she wasn't. She found herself staring at a very tall humanoid figure dressed in a silver gray one-piece jumpsuit. She said he was normally proportioned, arms and legs looked normal, but the head was very large and looked like a luminous globe resting on the figure's shoulders. She couldn't see any face, nor did he have any apparent neck, and was walking very slowly directly towards their house. And she could see now, as this figure got close, that it was at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Huge. It had a stocky body, was very muscular. She was absolutely amazed at what she was seeing, watched it for about 2 minutes, and she says it was the light from its head or helmet that actually allowed her to see the color of its jumpsuit. Now at the same time, she was hearing this weird, high-pitched sound coming from behind the house opposite of theirs. So, at this point, she knew something very odd was happening. She panicked. She scooped up her 2 children, ran into her parents' bedroom. She refused to come out and just waited there until morning. She did not wake up her parents. But it was some time later, realizing that she had seen something really unusual that should be reported, she did contact researchers. An investigation followed. The investigators examined the area, which showed no physical evidence, no evidence of any strange visitors there. But the investigators did speculate about one thing. They wondered if the fact that the witness's house was the only one in the neighborhood with a light on, that this might have attracted the humanoid towards the residence. So there you go, another amazing case. A 9 foot tall humanoid wearing a silver jumpsuit. This certainly does not sound like a normal person. And the fact that the whole family saw the interior of their house light up, heard this strange noise immediately prior to this encounter, I think it's a genuine case. Pretty brief, yes, but absolutely unusual. Perhaps not as unusual, though, as this next case, which I call the Shrugging Gray. Lots of accounts of gray ETs. This case is a really amazing one because this encounter occurred over a period of hours, all night pretty much. It involved 3 young witnesses, each of who corroborate each other's story. The behavior of the ET is so unusual in this case. There appears to be a strong possibility of missing time, though this was never really confirmed. But this case took place on July 21st, 1991, in an undisclosed location in central Missouri, the Show Me State. So, this case was also professionally researched by experienced investigators, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. This last and final case is so interesting and really quite poignant, I think. The witnesses in this case are 3 girls: Tina, age 12, Melissa, age 11, and Aubrey, age 10. These are pseudonyms, but as investigators Dwayne and Susan Bedell say, all 3 girls are considered reliable witnesses. They have no history of fabrication and evinced considerable consternation and fright concerning their encounter. All 3 girls are bright, articulate, and above average in maturity for their age. So they are all best friends. Their encounter began quite late, around 2 a.m. on July 21st, 1991, again in central Missouri. We don't know the exact location. The girls had just finished watching TV. All the adults in the house were asleep, so they decided to go out into the backyard to jump on their trampoline. And they had just started playing. Melissa and Aubrey, the younger ones, were jumping on the trampoline while Tina, again age 12, watched. And this is when all 3 of them noticed a white oval-shaped object dart from the side of the house and descend towards the ground at the corner of the backyard. But they weren't really paying much attention to it. They kind of assumed it was just a car headlight. But a few minutes later, they heard weird, strange rustling noises, and at the same time, the next-door neighbor's dog started barking. Tina, the oldest, stopped watching Melissa and Aubrey jumping on the trampoline and looked to the corner of the yard and was absolutely shocked to see a strange humanoid standing in front of the tree, about 30 feet away. She described it as small, white, very skinny, with a bald egg-shaped head with kind of a ridge on top, large dark eyes, and long skinny fingers. She did notice something very strange. The abdominal area of the figure looked almost translucent. She felt like she could see the tree behind it through its body. This left her speechless and frightened because she could hardly believe what she was seeing. At this point, she's the only one who sees this. But then Melissa asked what Tina was looking at, and Tina pointed to this figure. Melissa turned just in time to see this little gray ET start to move slowly towards the girls. And it advanced about 20 feet away, pushing aside a low-hanging branch, which was later measured to be about 53 inches from the ground. And it was weird because as it moved closer, it seemed to hunch its shoulders up in a sort of slow, shrugging motion. And it also opened its mouth widely, still advancing. Melissa had the impression it was sort of tiptoeing towards them. She described it really the same way as Tina did, but added that it had a very protruding forehead and the back of its head stuck way out. She also noticed a weird sort of dent in its head. She said it had almost no noise whatsoever. So needless to say, this frightened both Tina and Melissa. Tina turned and ran, followed instantly by Melissa, who actually leapt off the trampoline and followed Tina. They both abandoned poor young Aubrey behind. Aubrey had not seen the alien yet, so she called out to her friends, and they quickly shouted out, "Behind you! Come on!" So Aubrey, curious of course, turned around to see what her friends were running from and was shocked to see this gray ET, which was now standing right next to the trampoline, with its shoulders still hunched in this weird shrugging posture and its mouth wide open. I can only imagine how Aubrey felt to see this being so close, but she leapt off the trampoline, ran, nearly falling down, into the house, which was about 20 feet away. So once inside, the girls closed and locked the door. They looked at the clock and were shocked to see that it was now 3 a.m. and that 1 hour had elapsed since they went outside, which they felt couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. So there's a possibility of missing time here. But they ran and woke up one of the adults in the house, one of the girls' cousins, who was somewhat young, but definitely an adult, told them that they had just seen a ghost. He didn't believe them and went right back to bed. Now the girls did want to wake up their parents, but it was already so late that they just decided to retreat to the den. None of them wanted to go to sleep as they were still pretty frightened. They thought the encounter was over, but it wasn't. They turned on the TV and started to watch it when they heard Melissa's cat meowing strangely and scratching at the door outside. The last thing the girls wanted to do was open the door, but hearing this cat, they finally did. Weirdly, and contrary to its normal behavior, the cat ran away. It didn't go inside, but after some coaxing, they encouraged the cat to come inside. They continued watching the TV when suddenly it began to malfunction. The screen glowing blank and showing only white static. This is when movement at the den window caught their eye. All three girls looked and were shocked to see the alien looking at them through the window. The gray first looked at Aubrey, turned its head jerkily and looked at Melissa, turned its head again and looked at Tina. All three girls noticed this weird, strange jerking motion, which they said was not at all like a normal person. Later, investigators decided that this little gray had to be standing on a bale of hay that was right below the window. Now the girls fled in a group to the basement. After several minutes, they climbed back upstairs, went into the den to see if the gray was still there, and it was, still looking through the window. They fled back to the basement, and they ended up doing this several times, and the gray was there each time. The girls were unsure how many trips they made, but it was several, they said. Finally, thankfully, morning arrived. The girls told their experience to Melissa's parents, whose home it was. Melissa's parents went straight to the den and said that there was nothing there. They did notice that the TV was off, which the girls denied having shut it off, so that was strange. So after going over this with investigators, they did wonder about the missing time aspect, since the girls insisted they were out there for no more than 5 or 10 minutes when they saw this ET. Another weird detail was that Tina said she recalled doing something when they saw this entity the second time looking through the window, but she couldn't remember what it was. As she says, "I forgot what we did." After correlating the girls' descriptions, the height of the entity was estimated at about 4.5 feet. The investigators do believe that there very well could be more to this encounter, but as far as I know, hypnosis was never pursued. I do wonder if the witnesses in this case experienced more than just a sighting of a humanoid, given that this gray hung out their window pretty much all night. I can only imagine. But yeah, there's some confusion about time here. The TV apparently turning off by itself when no one remembers doing this. Some memory problems associated with the whole sighting. But can you imagine seeing this gray looking in your window, fleeing to the basement and then going up and checking on it several times and it's still in the window looking at you? Wow, amazing. It's truly astonishing to me how many cases there are like these. It's not just these 10. I've been doing these episodes for a pretty long time now, case after case after case. So I think it's long past the time for any type of denial, ridicule, disbelief, or skepticism. You can say that these are just stories, but the truth is there is evidence, as we've seen in this case. These cases, I should say, There's physiological evidence. There's animal reactions. There's electromagnetic effects. There's landing traces. There's all kinds of evidence. So saying there's no evidence is simply not true. And when you have multiple witnesses to a single incident reporting these things, that adds another level of credibility. And when you have people all over the world, many who have never even thought about UFOs before, or telling very similar details, that adds another level of credibility. I said it before, but it bears repeating. The only reason people are still skeptical on this subject is because we are all victims of the government cover-up, the worldwide government cover-up on this subject. Again, it's very well funded, very well orchestrated, a lot of money spent, a lot of time spent. And that's one of the reasons I really do this research, because so many people are having these experiences. They need to know they're not alone. All humanity deserves to know the truth that we are being visited by apparent extraterrestrials. And we can argue all day till the cows come home about who they are and where they come from. But the fact is, it's real. And that alone, I think, is the most important fact people need to understand. All right, that's it for now. I want to thank you once again for watching. I truly appreciate it, guys. It's because of you I do this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. It's out there. And most important, keep having fun. That's why we're here. I will talk to you next week. Bye for now.